I'm Elijah Meeks. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Notable and also one of the co-founders of the Data Visualization Society. And I'm happy to welcome you to the third installment of the DataViz Career Interview Series. For the last two interviews, we interviewed a product designer and a design scientist. And this time, I'm happy to welcome Peter Beshai, who's a staff data visualization engineer at Netflix, to talk about how his career journey went. Peter, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm happy to have you. I'm really excited to get into our conversation. I think that there are some specific points in the earlier interviews that I really wanted to touch on, some specific work that folks were doing. But with you, I'm really interested because I think that your career journey touches on a lot of aspects of data visualization as a field and as a profession and as a sort of way of understanding and making meaning in our data-driven world. I think that there's a lot that you're doing that's going to be interesting to folks who are interested in becoming professional data visualization practitioners. But I also think that there's a lot that you've done that's very interesting for folks who are more interested, like I am, a little bit academically about the field, but also about just how we're sort of changing the way that we're understanding things that we don't think of as being data-driven, like sports and things like that. So totally. I'd love to get right into it, but why don't you talk to me a bit about how you got into data visualization? Like, when was it you realized bar charts, this is my life?
It really comes down to always the bar charts is the best answer, isn't it? Yeah, I think probably, for me, it was a journey through like user experience design probably, and it kind of found its way into data viz because I was always interested in math and computers, and my undergraduate was in both math and computer science. And at some point along the way, I had this co-op term, and one of my mentors on that term sent me this article, and he was like, I think you'll like this. And it was a Brett Victor article about user interfaces or something, and it was super long, and it took me a couple of weeks to read or something. But right. I was like, yeah, totally. It's not, microwaves are dumb, or like, these things should be easier to use. And that's kind of like what sparked the whole, like, I had a lot of strong opinions about how things should be easy to use. And then over time, I was like, okay, I like making things easy to use, and I think about math, and I'm using computers, and somehow I met in my graduate studies, I put the words data visualization together when I kind of like met a good friend of mine, Matt Bremer, and he was doing that as his like, PhD studies with Tamara Munster at University of British Columbia. And unfortunately, Tamara was on like some kind of sabbatical, and so she didn't offer the data viz course in my master's degree. But luckily, I at the last minute decided to do a PhD, and she offered it in that first term, and I took it, and I was like, yes, this is, yeah, go ahead.
Let me talk about Brett Victor, because Brett Victor is often a figure that looms large in stories from this era. I'm going to really put you in like a historical context in this interview, and you can feel free to break out of it. But like this era, and Brett Victor was just a huge influence. Like the explorable explainables, the idea, like you said, of UX that embraced information. Why is it that you think that he was sort of so effective in mobilizing people's imagination around not just data visualization, but data-driven interfaces and things like that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Like for me, I was only very lightly, I had that one article, but when I look back, back at, I didn't reread it, but I look back because I was, reasonably young. I was in my early 20s, or maybe even just 19 or something when I discovered it. And I was like, man, it was just really long and thorough and had a lot of like solid, like real world examples. It's funny to look back now because it's like 2006 or something, and you see the picture of U-Haul or Amazon, and it's so ugly, but like, he can still make his points. And I was like, man, this is just, you just find yourself nodding and agreeing and seeing the actual in practice, and it's very relatable, at least for me, especially when there was no words for it for me at that time. Like I had never heard the words user experience or like interface design in my life until this article came in my inbox from Hugo Duncan, my co-op supervisor, who was just like, I think you'll like this. And I was like, oh, this is a thing. It was like, that moment, I think everyone has a moment at some point in their career where they're just like, they learn there's a thing, there's a name for that thing that they care about. Or maybe it's
Right.
just like by learning that this thing exists, you come to care about it. I don't know. I'm kind of like if Hugo never sent me that article, like what would have happened in my life? I don't know. But it definitely
That's for another
resonated.
interview. That's for, I mean,
I
I
know.
should start another interview series, like what people do after they drop out of data viz, because there are a few
Oh
of those
yeah,
people, and that would
farming
be interesting.
and
Farming,
relaxing,
marine
scuba
biology.
diving. Yeah, exactly.
No, that's clearly what some of them are doing. So so you had the initial article and with uh, from Brett Victor. So were you interested in any of his later work, any of the programmable stuff with like pieces of paper? Are you even familiar with it?
No, I mean I've heard his name come up a
Uh,
lot of times, and actually, what I was doing, I was like, I hope this guy isn't someone who's been canceled. Like, I don't know what the latest on Brett Victor is.
I don't know what the latest is either. But he put together these explorable explainables, which were these sort of interactive, basically dashboards, right, or interactive reports, or
Mm,
interactive scrolly telling notebook kind of things.
okay.
And you know, 10, 15 years ago. And people had often talked about dynamic documents. People had often talked about
Right.
anything where the data set could be um, embedded in it and the controls could be embedded in it. The graphs, the charts might be dynamic or something like that. When I was at Stanford, we tried to pioneer something called an interactive scholarly work, where all of the data and all of the visualization was somehow um, richly tied, not just a figure for or separate from the text. So people have had that dream for years. And I wonder, when it comes to where you were going, because you were talking about how you weren't aware of UX, right? For you, this wasn't like, I wasn't aware of cool arctan angles
Right.
and swoopy arrows. Like for you, you're already from the very beginning talking about user experience, which
Yes.
often is an afterthought in data
Mm.
visualization.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, my path was definitely like I was computer science, like programming all the time, and like I always wanted to be able to make things completely myself. And maybe because I just didn't wasn't good at finding collaborators, but and I was like, well, how do I make something better? And I spent like a lot of my time, I just know in my development, like looking at things that I thought were well made and being like, why do I like this? Why is this good? Or like, why is this bad? And like really just thinking about things. And when I was trying to build something, be like, okay, can I like go and find similar things and say like, why does that look good? And like,
Yeah.
whether it was that would help develop graphic design, but UX stuff. And then it was just, I think I just am very easily irritated. And so when I use something, and I tend to like use my own tools a lot, like when I'm building them, and I'm like, okay, that's annoying. And if something's annoying, then I just like
Right.
redesign it to be less annoying for me. And
Right.
that process has led, it's kind of like my very center. Even now, when I do my work in Netflix doing data viz design and application building, I'm like, it all comes from UX first for me, of like, how do I make this as easy to use and as easy to understand? And then you bring in the data viz stuff, like what about the human perception, and like what about the questions, like the analytical
Yeah.
constraints we have here. But I feel like it's so tightly related. Like we're just people trying to interpret something very complex and trying to interact with something that's quite complex. And like user-centered design, I think is, I to me, I'm like, I can't even separate them. I'm like, data viz is just like a specialty on top of it in my mind.
No, I mean, I'm in total agreement. There are certain intersections that we have, like wanting to do everything myself, and also um, recognizing that something about this experience makes this valuable, and not necessarily the look and feel or the geometric magistry of like whatever somebody had managed to figure out with
Right.
their chart. The difference is that I still didn't. It wasn't my focus when I was really deep in it. I was more interested in novel displays of information, like novel
Right.
ways of and I think that's dominated the field for a little too long, and we
Hmm.
really sort of lifted up these people who said, haha, I bet you never thought that you could show particles flying along a Sankey. And people are like, oh my God, I didn't realize you could. This is wonderful. And, it's the whole sort of Jurassic Park meme, right? Like we were so excited to see if we could, we didn't really think on whether or not it mattered. Whereas the
Right.
UX centered approach, one of the reasons why I wanted to interview designers first was I wanted, because I think that's I think that we've over-optimized, or at least we had, especially when building these libraries, because so many of these libraries, like, D3, spectacular library, and
Oh yeah.
afforded us all the ability to do all of this, not exactly embedded either in an ecosystem of really beautiful UX examples or itself sort of promoting
Sure.
strong UX principles.
Totally. Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. And it's kind of interesting to think that way. But I get that. I've got that feedback a lot of the Jurassic Park reaction of like, did you even stop to think if you should?
Right.
Because I think there is also like the fun aspect of it. I mean, that's like one of the joys of data viz is like, yeah, we have like, the serious work of like, let's make this easy to interpret and like, let's make this like accurate as much as we can. It's going to be a representation. So there's going to be some gap, but like, let's do the best we can. But let's also think about the delight side. And like, I always feel like it's a really core tenet to like doing any work in data viz is like we're working with people, right? Like we're not building for a machine with just like perceptual ratings. Right. Like it's like this is a person who has like some emotional reaction and that's going to impact their interpretation of things. And so like, yeah, we maybe went too far. I don't know. Like, but it is like, I still feel like, often the answer, if you don't think about it all, is like, let's just use a bar chart or a line chart. And like, they're going to be so perceptually sound. It's going to be great. But, when you have a whole wall of them, no one's going to look at any individual one. And so there's some balance there of like, well, we need to bring some delight and some joy, and that'll keep people like open and keep people to actually like, because if you make the most accurate representation you can, but no one wants to look at it, it's not really valuable.
Yeah. I've been making the argument in a couple of places that that we're always in an attention economy. Yeah. Even when you're at work. Like that was my first experience. When I went from Stanford to Netflix, it was I was so excited because at Stanford, I couldn't force people to use things, right? Stanford, it was like people would just use them if they wanted to. Whereas at Netflix, because it was a real job, it was a real then there was hierarchy and there was some guy with a whip and he would say, now you
have to use that.
You're using this. And what I found out, that's not the case at all, right? You build something. And people just say, I don't know. I clicked on it a couple of times and then I was done with it. I just didn't really understand it. And it was a really formative experience because it impressed on me, to go back to the UX thing, the importance of UX, the importance of UI design, but also that there was a value for stickiness and for grabbing eyeballs and all of these principles we think of that are associated with comms work or journalism work, that it's totally there internally, building a dashboard for the algo team, right? Like it's.
Yeah, totally.
Can you talk a little bit about, like, have you had that experience? What is it? Have you built something, whether it was in freelance work or, in industry, where it was great and nobody used it, or there was a surprising, like maybe not lack of adoption, but maladaptation of it?
Yeah, I think everyone has some experience with this. I mean, because like for me, sometimes you like you're just in a very, the most recent one I could think of is like, I had to build this thing at Netflix for partnerships, and the space was like very complex, like outrageously complex, just because of like your human agreements that were made that don't follow a nice system of rules or something. And so now the complexity is not in like, oh, Netflix has a partnership with some company. The complexity is like, we've created new rules for all the contracts, and there's no like, it's not a simple, you can't like reason through it easily. And so like I found I had to, I was asked to like help people navigate this space, and the space itself was extremely complex. And I like came up with this crazy Sankey tree combo chart, which looked great, I thought. But I looked at it myself, and I had been spending like months thinking about this space, and I was like, the space is insane. I can't understand it even. Like, and I drew this diagram. I'm like, this is the most accurate representation. And like the other analytics engineers in the team are like, yeah, this is it. This totally covers everything. But anyone else looks at it and they're like, what is this? And I'm like, but this is the system. Like, right. And there's like any simplification was like, felt like it was misleading in some way. And so it was this awkward thing. There was a lot of time went into it. It came out. It was like a little bit new and interesting, but I think the actual usage of it, despite I thought being the most accurate representation, it's like, well, maybe it is, but like still people are not getting enough value out of it because like it's still too hard to interpret or something. Like, and so I don't think people actually use this view that I spent so much time on, which is a weird thing for me, where I'm like, it actually is like what the system is, right? And the system is just insane. But people don't want to, there's like some difficulty gap there where someone's like, I don't want to like, I can't wrestle with this right now, or maybe a few extreme experts can. And so like, why did you spend all this time? The few experts already knew how the system works. So like, I don't know. It's kind of that's kind of an unfortunate outcome. I still like look at it sometimes. I'm like, man, it's pretty nice, but it
I mean, we have remarkable parallels, because I also built a incredible Sankey at Netflix that nobody used. That was incredible. It was really incredible. So maybe Netflix is the place for doing that.
yeah,
This is an
maybe.
interesting. I think on this topic, let's pull up your career journey and take a look at how you mapped out your career. Because what I think of here, right, is like what you just described. It's the same thing here, right? This is an incredibly complex thing that you have represented in a way that's not complex.
Sure.
I mean, you have distilled it, and you've done all of this in a way that you could have done something differently, right? We give this prompt to every interviewee. You could have come up with the most complicated Sankey diagram. Now, granted, you're not going to spend 8 months on it for a 1 hour interview. I don't expect that, but it is interesting how we learn and receive feedback supporting that people don't want to wrestle with the accurate representation of a complex system.
It's true.
And
yeah, totally.
so, I mean, here's your life. Here's your entire life, or at least, a major part of it. I mean, hell, childhood's in here, right?
Hey, gotta go hard.
Why is it that we think that when we do this professionally, we build professional information displays for complex subjects, for highly educated people who want badly to win, right?
Yes.
Why is it that you think that still it's a challenge, that there has to be this sort of convincing or distillation or salesmanship that has to go on with some of them, these more ambitious data visualization displays?
I think it's just like this. Well, some of these things are in such like a complex space that there's like this barrier of like natural human psychological tendency. Like, so for instance, right now I work in a space that involves an incredible amount of like overlapping groups. But like people really want to think about things as non-overlapping. It's like if I talk about action fans and I talk about sci-fi fans, it's like very easy to reason about these as separate groups of people. But the reality is these are a very strongly overlapped group of people. And like when you look at when you try to visualize something where you're like, I need to make sure people remember that these are not distinct, these are overlapped. And it's like so counter to a very natural way to interpret. Like I feel like most charts you're not dealing with this. And so when you have any standard representation, like you have a natural like there's like a fight you have to have, which is like, okay, I know this normally
the chart won't let you.
Right. Yeah. It's like what do you do where you're just like, you have to battle people's natural intuition sometimes for these more complex systems. And like, I don't know, like often I feel like some people are going to be willing to engage in that level. Right. And so I think often in my life is or the way it works out for me at Netflix anyway, is like, well, someone doesn't want to, like, let's say like Ted and Reed, they don't want to deal with that, right? The CEOs of Netflix don't want to deal with that, but there's like some level of analysts below them that maybe will deal with it, and they'll like distill it to like some writing. And because I'm in the tool building space, it's kind of like, I'm not generating a one-off report. I'm generating some kind of tool that will help some analysts understand what's happening and then distill it into a point for someone else to read at a higher level. And I think like, it's so hard to imagine for me, just a data viz like bridging that gap on its own, like the human explaining, like helping you walk through it. And even these analysts, like, is helpful and have like our expert data scientists walk them through the tool, like, because it's so jarring to get used to this. Like when you're in a system that like doesn't line up with intuitive interpretations of some kind of chart form that you're used to looking at, whether it's like a pie chart or a bar chart or a line chart, and you're like, wait, this one's higher than this, and so like, this one's totally separate, or like, it just gets, I feel like there's limitations. There's just limitations because we have we just like, I think humans are very quick to like make judgments. And like sometimes, and this comes up a lot with uncertainty, I think, which is like, I have this opinion on uncertainty viz, which is I think you want to make it uncomfortable to look at. Because like when something's too easy to look at, you're just gonna you want people to stop and think. Because like I don't currently see as any solution for uncertainty where you're like, this is how we can represent it, and people will realize, oh, it could be any, we're not sure. There's just like, oh, it's the center of that thing. Oh, it's the center of this. Oh, it's this thing. Or like, And so I feel like there's just like this battle with data viz where you got to think about, okay, we got to make it joyful to experience. We got to make it easy to look at and understand, but we don't make it so easy that someone takes the wrong takeaway from it. And so that's kind of I think that's challenging because we experience this like mixed level of data literacy. And like, how do you get the people that are your stakeholders or your audience to like draw the right conclusion when you don't necessarily have full control on like their level of data literacy? And like, is it tooling that helps? Is it more explanation? Is it like meetings or classes? I don't know. It's just, but I feel like there's like a gap there that's like super hard to, it's just hard. That makes the job interesting though. It's like, how do you navigate this difficult space?
I think that it's interesting because I did some work, some research on Wikipedia in grad school, and I was at one of these Wikimania or something, and we were talking about the George W. Bush Wikipedia page. And somebody was saying, well, why is the George W. Bush Wikipedia page a mess and like it's constantly changing and blah, blah, blah? Isn't this a sign that Wikipedia is like not a sort? This is the early days before people had given up and accepted Wikipedia. And I had said that, the George W. Bush Wikipedia page is in flux because his presidency is in flux. Like, what is it that you want? You want us to have the 50-year-old perspective on a presidency while it's in progress? That seems rather not the right perspective.
Right.
And I feel like that's the case with, people want these charts to be the sort of classic Tufty chart that allows me to make an important decision in 15 minutes. You're like, well, this isn't that kind of data. Like this data, you're going to have to sit down. You're going to have to put on a beret, light a cigarette, like really spend some time getting to know this data.
Yeah, totally.
Let's talk about your career path. That's
all right.
We love to get into these. Talk to me about, first of all, before we get into the details, the form, because we give the prompt. And have you seen the earlier career paths that folks?
I did look at a couple of them. I think there was like a comic and there was maybe a timeline.
Yep. So what made you decide on this form? And I'm not just talking about the sort of snakes and ladders path, but also like what you decided to put along that path.
Yeah, totally. Well, I mean, there's a constraint, obviously, which is we have it's being shared in this format. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to have it. I decided at some point it was going to wrap. I mean, at some point I tried a lot of things, not a lot, but I was like, oh, maybe I'll do a spiral. Maybe I'll do something else. I'm like, this is all dumb. This is the easiest that I came up with. And I didn't want to spend a lot of time on it, like you said. I'm like, okay. Also, it's just like hard because like, as you start off with this level of ambiguity, it's like, tell us about your career path. And I'm like, where does a career begin? Like, what actually, like, to me, I'm like, what actually, and I was like, I put on my first thing here. I put on this like typing device that I had when I was in first or second grade. My mom, it was called Typewrite 2. And you basically learn to type on it. And this is like back in 94 or whatever. And my mom could type 90 words per minute. And my goal, I was like, wanted to beat her. And I did. And I'm very fast typist nowadays. And thanks, Mom. Really appreciate you. But so like, I'm like, this is like maybe where it begins, like, using this stuff. And I'm like, okay. And I did like this programming when I was quite young, and web development started early because I was putting animated GIFs on GeoCities and building stupid apps and stuff like that. And then I'm like, okay,
stupid, Peter.
Okay, you're right. They were really fun. There's a lot of Diablo and StarCraft stuff going on there. My fan pages, Quake pages. But I had a lot of fun doing that stuff. And I was like viewing source of blizzard.com to figure out how they did their nav rollovers, like when I was in 6th or 7th grade or something. Like I was just like a weirdo.
Back when you could view source and then you could actually read it.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, how are they doing this? And I remember being so mad through high school, actually, that it was so hard to get a semi-transparent background in a div in the web back then. You had to use a spacer GIF of some sort that had like some transparency to it or something. Like it was very annoying. There was no RGBA back then. But anyway, I don't know. I kind of thought like, why is there? I decided to put a lot of people on here. That was like what I realized was like I was like, these are things I did, okay, but I felt like it was the people that I met along the way that like really influenced where I ended up, and like showed me things were possible or got me to think in new ways. And so like the first one was Hugo Duncan, who I mentioned earlier, who showed me Brett Victor and was extremely influential. And actually the reason I switched out of pure math into computer science / math after I did my co-op term with him. And so I don't know, I went obviously through the jobs I had, but then it was like a lot of it was people. people. They were such influences. And then there's a couple conferences in there, which not necessarily that I was involved with, although I was with one. It was, but like going to them and also meeting people there and seeing work there and being inspired, I think we're extremely influential in terms of like, I can do this, you can do this, you can spend your time on these things. It's accepted, like people value it. There's a community. And I found like at one point, like when I was at the Celtics, I felt quite lonely as a reason I ended up leaving the Celtics, because I was like the lone database or programmer there mostly. Even though I loved everyone there and it was a great work environment and it was awesome, but I just felt like I didn't have a community of people I could talk to about things. And eventually that's why I left. And like going to these conferences is a good way to do that, I thought.
Let's talk about your time at the Celtics. This is, I mean, 2015.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, like seeing React in 2013. I'm like, that React wasn't around in 2015. That's
oh, it was. You could find my GitHub issue on the OG React page, archived GitHub. But it was like I said, very hipster, because there was like a small talk at Vancouver's Facebook.
Oh yeah,
office.
no, I'd imagine. I felt pretty good because I got into it at I want to say point 11 or point 12, which I thought was when
that
it started.
Seems quite old. Come on, that's quite old.
But the Celtics. So you were in your PhD program, and then you were on a basketball team. Like, how did you make that decision? You're like, these eggheads, I'm done with this. I'm gonna go hang out with the jocks. It sounds like a high school, like a Stranger Things season 4 thing.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that's the way it happened is like I finally, like I said earlier, I finally got this chance to do Tamara's data viz course at UBC, and I was like, I'd never done D3 before then, and I was just like, okay, so but I was like super interested in this space, and I had just started my PhD, and so I was kind of just doing classwork at this point, and so I was like, you know what, I'm gonna go like all in on building my class project, and I was like, I'm gonna just build this. I was a huge Raptors fan. I'd been following basketball for maybe like 8 years at that point, quite intensely, and I was like, I used to do basketball, and at the time, I think the only existing things were like Basketball Reference. There's not really any other kind of viz related to.
Sure.
I mean, but Kirk Goldsberry was like one of the OG person making viz in this space, 2D shots, because he was a cartographer turned sports.
Yeah, former GIS guy, isn't that great?
Yeah, totally. And so he was doing cool stuff, and I was like, well, I want to like automatically make these things. I should be able to do it. And that's kind of like my approach was like, I want to do this thing. I don't know how to do it. I have no idea how to do it. And so I went and I like learned D3 in this. The class was just like, you have to make a project, do whatever you want. And I was like, all right, I'm going to learn D3. And I found Scott Murray's book online. It was free online at the time.
Yep.
And I learned D3.
Strange business model.
I know, it was online for like 7 years.
Everybody got this book for free. You know, O'Reilly was like, hey, we'll have this interactive book that people will have for free. And I just thought, how do you get reimbursed for that?
So I built the project buckets, over a couple of months in this class. And I was like, I didn't use Twitter or anything beforehand, but I was like, oh, there was this website, Nylon Calculus, which was like the savvy basketball stats website. And I just like tweeted at Kirk Goldsberry, and I never used Twitter before. I tweeted at Kirk Goldsberry and Nylon Calculus. I was like, hey, I made this thing. Check it out. And I put it on Reddit as well. I think it got removed from Reddit for self-promotion. And then, but then Nylon Calculus people liked it. They actually looked at it and they liked it and they retweeted it. And then my little janky server that I didn't really configure, like got the hug of death from like some basketball folks. And then anyway, it was a very exciting experience, but it drew a lot of attention to like, oh, you can build this sort of stuff. And there's nothing in the space that was like this kind of level. And so I got, a few, maybe like 4 teams reached out to me after that was just like tweeted and updated. And one of them was the Celtics. And I like them. They like me. And I decided, okay, even though I just started my PhD, I'm going to quit. Maybe we'll do it as a leave of absence. And I'm going to move to America. I'm Canadian. And I'm going to go live in a city where I know one person. And we'll just see how it goes. Because I think the opportunity to work for a basketball team seemed very rare and exciting. Yeah. But it was all just like, I basically just made this project that I worked really hard on. And I just shared it. And I was like, there's no downside to sharing. And my actual goal for sharing was I'm going to include like public reaction in my paper. Like in my class paper. I was like, I'm just going to include what people said as like part of my like feedback in my like Viz project paper. And it ended up being like, oh, people like this and people wanted to pay for it. So wow, my life changed just because I like worked really hard and then shared something online, and it happened to be, you know, people liked it in that moment. And so
I
that's how
mean,
I
it's
ended up at the
incredible.
Celtics. Yeah.
It's incredible to think of that era. Like I said, I'm going to ruthlessly contextualize you, but really, like there was during this mid 20 teens, it did seem like you could know about everything that everyone was doing in Viz. And
Yeah.
it also seemed like people were doing, and I don't want to, like this isn't pure Viz that we're talking about, right? You're basically like kind of an analytics engineer
Yeah,
because
totally. Full stack,
because
all the way.
you've got a perspective on the analysis. You are using Viz to build a UI and enable your stakeholders to explore the system. Um, and it did seem like you could just tweet something out and be connected to opportunities. Whether I
Yes.
mean, I'm trying to avoid saying jobs because it's not necessarily jobs,
No, yeah.
but
Yeah, totally.
it was a really vibrant community in a way that I think that all these communities have gotten larger. The data viz community has gotten much larger and much more structured and professionalized. What would you like? What's the difference? Try to put yourself back into that like exuberant era, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And and what is the difference? Do you use Twitter much these days?
I mostly lurk on Twitter now.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think
And
like so back then it was exciting. You know, I hadn't used Twitter before then, but I came to realize
yep.
like, oh, it was such an incredible professional tool, you know, and because I was like, oh yeah, I could just follow a certain set of people, and they were like, you know, putting stuff out all the time, you know, whether it was like Shirley
Yeah.
Wu or Naughty Bremer or Moritz
Yeah.
Stefano,
Yeah.
you know, like people just doing stuff, and I'm like, damn, look at all this cool stuff that's happening, and I was like, okay, now I'm entering the fray with my little stinky sports viz. And I know a lot, you know, it's kind of a weird space, especially for me as like not really a sports person. I just like basketball, and now I work for a sports team and get pigeonholed, but that's how it goes. But you know, I felt like that space was like people are pretty welcoming, you know, people are pretty nice. So, like this thing is
Yeah.
really cool. Even people, because people would say like,
Yeah.
what one of the most interesting feedback I got was like, I don't even like basketball, but I like play with this thing. And I
Right.
was like, oh, that's cool. Like this is motivating. Like you can get, you know, this is another thing where I was like, I didn't know this was possible. I didn't even think like I didn't have a lot of mentors in my life that were like, you can do these things, by the way.
Yeah.
You can just create things, and if you make it, if you do a good job, like maybe it'll. And also, there's luck there. It's like you can do a great job and no one finds it, or you know, I happen to be people like to at this time, like you're saying, in this era where it was like, wow, look at this thing this nobody made, and like this is awesome. And I feel like now, I guess there's a little bit of fatigue that sets in over 7 or 8 years of like it turned out to me a reason why
Yep.
I don't engage that much on Twitter anymore. Is like I started to feel like actually it was like a ambient stressor. It was like,
Mm-hmm.
man, all these people are doing so many things. Like I should be doing more
Yeah. Yeah.
things. I'm not doing enough things. I'm not sharing enough things. And like turned out like that was not really positive overall for my life. And so I like took a step back from that. And but now I'm like, actually, are people just doing less things? They're just sharing less. I don't know. I don't see as much anymore. Or
I
oh,
mean,
these
I
people
think
not.
what you're describing is a general social media thing, but
Mm,
also a data viz specific social media thing. And it's I think that I don't think that it's that people aren't doing as much. I think things have naturally sort of gotten a little bit more conservative. Like there's better best
mm,
practices, and I think that's why you're
for sure.
seeing arguments right now. And you're only lurking on Twitter. I spend a little more time there, but there's a growing sort of frustration with best practices and
Mm,
guides and things like that. And I think that that's really becoming more and more prominent to folks. And that's because we've reached this level of maturity in the field where some cowboy like you could just throw some dots on a map and people are like, I've never seen basketball dots before, this is great. And now somebody does it and they say, God, this looks like Peter Beshai's work from 8 years ago. Haven't you paid attention to the to
right.
so and so's
Yeah.
book on how to do sports biz? Like we call it sports biz now.
Right.
um
Yeah.
so I see open bizconf here.
Yeah.
Like that was a
Yeah.
huge thing for
Amazing.
folks in
Amazing.
in like a circle, right? This is a small
Yeah.
conference, couple of days long.
Yeah.
um,
300 people or so.
and it
And
ran how many years? 3 years, 4 years?
I think five-ish years.
Five.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it had run a couple times, but I think before I went to the one I went to, my first one. Where I ended up working at the company Boku later that ran the conference, and I helped program one of the instances. But I went immediately because like I had met Matt Matt Bremer like back at
Yep.
UBC, and he was like, "You should go." I was living in Boston, it took place in Boston, and I was like, "He's like, you got to
Yep.
go to
That
OVC."
makes it
And
pretty easy.
I had just moved there in February. I just joined the Celtics, and I was like, "All right, companies pay for conferences, right?" I was like, "Hey, Danny Ainge, like, can I go to this conference?" And he's like, "Yeah, sure, whatever." So, he's the general manager of the team, and like at the time. And so I went to this conference on like my second or my month and a half in working at the Celtics, and I was like, man, this is so because like OpenViz was like it was like an interesting niche space because it was trying to talk about open source like Viz
Yep.
solutions, balancing like design and engineering and like academic practices and journalism. But it was like all about enabling others to contribute Viz or like to do Viz themselves. It wasn't just like, here's my showcase. It was like learn how to do this too, like empower yourself and like empower the community. And like it was supposed to, had a very strict code of conduct, and it was supposed to be
Yep.
very inclusive space. And so you got this like interesting blend of coding talks and kind of design talks, and it really like appealed to a nice group of people, especially those of us that were like interested in like the ethics around open source. And I remember going there, and Jeff here and his team, like maybe they're giving like a Polestar or Lyra or Vega or some talk, and I didn't know anyone, right? Obviously, I was not known to the Viz community at this time. I was just like this weirdo Celtics guy who was like, why is a sports team person here? And I went up to like Jeff here's on team. I still remember this, of course I remember. And there's like 8 of them, and I'm like, hey, like, can I join you for dinner? And they all just kind of like looked at me like, what? No. That was my first awkward rejection of Viz. But eventually they became very nice. And I mean, I'm sure they were very nice. It was just like they had their
Right.
team dinner, and I was like, can I join? And I just remember that, and I was like, eventually we ended up, now we know each other,
Right.
I think. And so they're nice, very nice people. I really like them, but it was kind of a funny welcome to, there's like these awkward, like, I was like, I moved to
Yeah,
Boston,
because
didn't know anyone.
you
Yeah.
show up into what you realize is, hey, this is my community, and
Right.
sort of you can be so exuberant about that you're like,
Yeah.
hey, folks, I have things to say about. Like, I heard you talking about maps. I also make maps. Let me talk
Yeah.
about like how I like to put points on maps. And people are like, who are you?
Yes.
Why are you to them? Right? This isn't quite as extraordinary. Like, I
Right.
think that's
Yeah.
what's going on there. For you, it's like, oh my God, it's an entire crowd full of people who are
Right.
super interested in things I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Let's all hang out. For them, they're like, oh, this is another Viz conference, and we've got work to do, right? Like,
Right.
it's
Yeah.
it's
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 totally.
understandable how that ends up happening. And in fact, I think actually what you're describing is kind of the change in the community during this era, right? To a certain degree, this is like a metaphor for the entire change in the
Right.
community. Because early on, it was like you'd show up on Twitter and it's like, hey, I just
You
found
too.
out that you can use angles to encode data, and people are like, I found this out too. And now you show up and people are like, yeah, we're over here, like, we've got work to do. And I'm sure you found out about this, but go read these things or whatever. Go, catch up first before you
Yeah.
can join as a fully fledged member. And that kind of gatekeeping is natural
Yeah.
and problematic.
It is. It is. I mean, no hard feelings to them. I mean, that's just kind of how I feel like now. Eventually, I became part of this community, like from my repeated
Yeah.
attempts of doing things and sharing things. And when I joined Boku, that's super helpful for me.
Now, Boku is a really interesting
Yeah,
um,
amazing.
like phenomenon, right? Because Boku is still around now. They
Yeah,
do
totally.
consulting. But for a while, they really hired up with data viz people. They really invested in data viz, and eventually they cut the whole thing, right? They just
Yeah.
decided we're not doing data viz anymore.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky situation, but it was an amazing time to be there. Like Boaz, the founder, and Jory and the other leadership folks, like their hearts are in such a good place. It's a very open source oriented company, which is like such an interesting idea because like everyone there like this is the guy who made Grunt, or this is the guy who did the D3 logo, or this is the guy or the people that are like responsible for jQuery, or like it was like an interesting,
Yeah,
these people were like really well established in open source. Now they're all in JS Foundation, or they're on TC39 or whatever. Like they're like having a strong influence on open source, and like, in fact, I think they're still responsible for browser testing of JavaScript. Like, it's a crazy company that like does all this influential and important work with this, it is for profit, but like it's supporting open source like as its core value. And that was so exciting to me, as like, I was very into that at the time. I was like, I want to give back to the community, I want to share things. And Boku is both the place for that, but then it was also like, hey, it has actually a DataVis squad that has like these rock stars on it, and they're running Open VisConf, like, because again, it's the part of that open source ethos that they had. It was such a unique experience.
And did you work at all on MISO or any of the sort of chart standards at the time?
No, actually we didn't. I don't think, for us, it was not even like tooling. So back then, I think the tooling.
Well, I know that Irene was involved. Irene was involved with MISO a bit.
I'm sure. Yeah. So go ahead.
Well, what I'm curious about is, why do you think that, at this point, we're years into D3 being around, people getting more mature, why do you think there never was a sort of layer for charts and information visualization that was the equivalent of D3 for sort of core geometric data visualization? Like, why wasn't there ever a chart standard? Like, you see it with Vega, but Vega is highly constrained compared to sort of the way D3 works. And you see it, of course, with a series of chart libraries, but none of them are particularly thought out, right? None of them are deeply theorized like D3 was, or like ggplot or something like that. They're just sort of practical. And I know, MISO was one of those attempts. D3 chart was another one. Bostock during this period writes this article about like a standard for charts, and sort of, and I'm, maybe I haven't had much experience with observable plot, but maybe that's gotten somewhere close to there. But it doesn't, like, based on the outputs, it seems like it's a Vega competitor. I'm just curious, like, why do you think, this goes back to you having this job, like a data visualization engineer. The reason why there are data visualization engineers is because there just aren't good configuration-based ways of producing novel and sophisticated charts.
Yeah, I think, this is a really great question. I think it also ties into like maybe this like ebb and flow of like extreme creativity and like kind of pulling back to more conservative styles, because it's like basically what I've tried Vega, I've used D3 a lot. I built my own charting library now, as one does, and I've used ggplot, and I've used matplotlib, and I've used all these other things. Like, I've tried these things out, and I think the challenge is like when I use something else, I think this is like, maybe there's like a lack of this like UX consideration. So like on one side, we didn't know exactly all the forms we're going to use. It's very hard to design this general purpose charting library, because there's always like some weird like combination you didn't foresee, and like, can you be resilient to that? And I think it's possible. I'm making headway, I think. But I think it's like there's an exciting part with data is like there's like, sure, we've done a lot of new weird things, but there's probably more. There's probably something creeping around the corner, whether it's going to be useful or not, I don't know. And so it's hard to be like, people care about a lot of different things. So some people are like, oh, I think like semiotic had this kind of as a core for my external, I'm telling you what it had, but my perspective was like, oh, semiotic had like built in like this idea of this like framework of data which you can like morph in between the encoding of. And that seemed like foundational. I was like, I can go from this view to this view to this view to that view, and it's kind of like it's like, that's like an interesting take, like seeing the same data, different views.
I can understand, arguments about whether or not it's the valid take or something like that. The one thing I really like about semiotic was that at least I had an interesting take. Yeah, like, that's the one thing is I had and have, it's still alive. I have in mind some theory of data visualization, some theory of information visualization that says, hey, a tree map is like a force-directed network. It is. And it's because we're displaying topological data, and we're looking at similarity based on topological principles. And people could, people can definitely argue about the quality of code, because that's not been my strength. But, that's what rather than people saying, oh, well, this is the way forward, what I would love to see is competing takes, right? Competing theories of information visualization. Rather than just, hey, my theory of information visualization is I have like developers who need a bar chart, a pie chart, and a line chart. and they need an API for that, and it needs to be in TypeScript. Like that's not sufficient to develop, to move the field forward, to move the theory forward. And I don't think it's going to happen from academia, because of the classical difference between industry and academia. I think that there's lots of good ideas there, and things are going to come out. But I think that academia is both too radical and too conservative when it comes to data visualization. Just because the constraints of, and I don't want to get into like, this isn't, I don't want to overstate it, but fast forward for me to Netflix. You took a job, like why Netflix, and why now, and what is it being a staff data visualization engineer? What is that for people at home who might not have know that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, why Netflix? I think Netflix is a very interesting company for people in data viz space, data viz engineering space. I don't know like that this role exists commonly at other places. I don't know that this role makes sense to exist commonly at other places. Like, I think like, my I think I'm the like kind of like what I did with buckets, where I was I did the data scraping, I did like the whole ETL, I did the analysis, I did the backend API, I did the front end, I did the UX design, the graphic design, and the data viz design, all as one person building a project. I feel that this is an unreasonable expectation of a person, despite me doing it. I just think like people can do it, but it's like not that common. Like, so I think like this role doesn't exist commonly at other companies because you're asking a lot. And chances are, like, if you have the resource, like, it's very efficient if you have one person that can do all these things at least reasonably well, right? But it's hard to expect like really great results, people to be really great at all those aspects. And I'm definitely not like equal at all those aspects, right? I'm better at some than others, but I'm passable at all of them at least. And so my role is actually doing all that to some degree, and that varies. Like, because a lot of it's like kind of annoyance driven, where I'm like, I'm not going to wait for someone to write this ETL for me.
Right.
I'm going to just write this. I know how to write an ETL. I'll write an ETL. Or like, I like to do the design. I'm very opinionated and, like I said, irritable. So I like, I'm not going to, I'll design things till I'm not annoyed with them. And so, so I do all those things. I build like things like buckets for internal data, like these interactive, highly performant dashboards. Dashboards could mean a lot of things, but they're like, I think of them as analytical applications. Which is maybe a bit different. And well, I don't know, maybe not. I'm just,
I think it's a much better description of them. Absolutely. Because I mean, look, it reflects what you were describing as your work duties.
Right.
Because, people say data visualization engineer, and they're like, for 8 hours a day, I'm constantly adjusting, SVG values and colors and things like that.
Yeah.
No, I mean, what you described was a lot of other work necessary to have a performant and optimized information display, right?
Exactly. And so it's kind of interesting, prior to this interview, I was answering questions like, how much of your work is data viz task related? And I was like, well, how do you define data viz task related? Because like when I'm talking to stakeholders, ultimately it's like to power this analytical app that's like some data viz, or like if I'm building this ETL, it's to power this other, like it's all to the purpose of like sharing this data and helping people make inference from it. And so to me, I was like, everything I do basically, besides maybe a team meeting, is, so I think like the Netflix job is extremely.
This sounds like one of those complex charts that nobody wants to see, Peter.
Yes, totally. Yeah. I feel like, so Netflix is amazing for me because I get to do all these things that I find very interesting. And, now we're reaching a point. And so like, I think Netflix is known for its culture memo. This idea of freedom and responsibility is like a core tenet of it. And I think historically, especially like with you and Susie Liu pioneering data viz practice at Netflix, there's a lot more heavily leaning towards the freedom side, which is like now we have like 15 or so data viz engineers at Netflix. And
wow,
I know it's a lot. It's a lot. And like basically everyone's been, when I joined 2.5 years ago or whatever, I was like, hey, what's everyone using? They're like, whatever you want. And I'm like, oh, like interesting. What about this internal tool? They're like, no, we're not using that. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. And so it was very much like do what you want, which is like super exciting as like a person who likes to do what they want. But I think what's happening now, 2.5 years later, is like we're pencil swinging a bit more to the responsible. Like it's more responsible for Netflix for us to like share resources and to share solutions, and like we can gain some efficiencies, even if it's like I don't necessarily want to. I know some people are like, I don't want to use TypeScript, or some people are like, I don't want to use your stupid charting library, Peter.
Nobody wants to use TypeScript. I I mean, come on. But we all will.
Right. I know, exactly. Noah's the last domino to drop. But
always, as always.
yeah, so I think now we're just finding this being like this maturation process even within Netflix. It's just like, okay, listen, like we need to share more things. We need to be more responsible. And so now there's like this new opportunity, which is like, okay, can we come up with shared tooling that lets people do what they want to do? And so I think it like shifts the need. So like if you have a few people that are building this kind of like foundational tooling, and my goal with like the charting library I'm working on is like, I want you never to reach a point where you were building a chart and now all of a sudden you hit an edge where you couldn't customize it. And so you have to go back and rebuild it from scratch. And so like, this is like a core foundational idea for my charting library, which so far is working out over the last year and a half. And like, that's important, which means then like, you can focus more on the design aspect. And I feel like this is a trend that's going to happen, which is like, as the engineering side of data viz matures and we get, whether it's this kind of standard theory or like competing theories of data viz that can be used as foundations for building libraries on top of, eventually end up with these libraries that are flexible and powerful enough that you don't need someone who knows like WebGL or like the nuances of like mouse interaction where you want to support brush and zoom and hover. Like you don't need everyone to know that. You have like maybe one or two people that know that and other people can focus on how do we make this useful for our stakeholders? How do we like design things with human perception in mind and like make good decisions? And I think I'm like curious to see what happens with the engineering, the highly specialized like graphics programming side of data viz over time, and seeing if we do reach a point where the tooling supports it enough that people can focus on what I think actually is probably the harder problem of like, how do I make people engage with this and then make the right takeaways?
and bringing people in. And we talk about literacy all the time, making charts that support literacy, that draw people into. So speaking of charts, let's we're getting close to the end.
Wow,
so I wanted to give a chance to go through the gallery of some of the work that you've done. And you can talk to me about this.
Yeah, the OG.
James Harden. Do we really think that James Harden would be where he is today?
Yeah, so this is buckets. This is the original. Yeah, so this one, I mean, Tamara Munzer was
this is buckets that you. Yeah.
Right. This launched my career into data viz and got me to quit my PhD is when I released this. And it's like it's like a super packed system. There's a lot going on in it. I think just the month before it was released, or a couple months the previous IEEE Viz, there was a paper that came out that said you should have these like horizontal bars on your bar charts that like help you compare lines. So when you hover on it, it like drew these lines. And Tamara was like, it should be on, it's a dashboard. It should just be like one screen. It should fit on one screen. And so this app, uniquely of all my apps, is designed that way, so that like the charts it's not like a normal web app where you scroll. I mean, it does scroll, but like this main view is like it resizes to fit your full screen, which I never. I mean, that's very dashboardy, I would say, like, but I never really did that again. But yeah, there's never been
had people done heat maps of shooting on the court.
So there had just been like, basically, if you wanted one, you had to wait for Kirk Goldsberry to tweet one. It was basically only seen on his Twitter at that point, or Grantland articles. Rest in peace, Grantland. But that's like kind of where it was at the time. And there had never been these kind of 1D, or I call them like the 1D shot charts on the right, which were like, what if we make distance from the basket the x-axis? That was like, I don't think I had seen that before. And I found that to be a nice simplification of the 2D chart, which is quite difficult to read. And actually I had such an interesting learning experience with this, which was like, wait a second, baby data viz Peter was like, if I had that set to raw data, set to smooth data there in the middle, I was like, this doesn't look like the other charts I see. I'm like, and I realized, oh, actually, in all these viz that I'm seeing, it's not the actual data as how I thought of it. I'm like, it's some smoothing applied so that you can make inference from it. And I had this big moment of like, oh my God, that's interesting. And
I mean, this is a common theme with all of these interviews, is people realizing what are, mathematical data transformation principles from visualization. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at the next one. Let's see what else. Sure. I think that there's a band of some sort over here. Oh no, this is the Netflix one. This is one that
So I've had the luxury of doing some like fun viz in the mix of my analytical viz, and so this was something Susie Liu and I collaborated on recently for the CEO to give a talk at Cannes Lions for Netflix, just talking about the variety. So this was like people who watched Bridgerton in like the first month of its release also watched at least 1 million of them also watch every one of these, or at least one of these other shows. So like it was trying to say, oh wow, Netflix members engage in a lot of variety of content. It's not like people who
Right.
watch Bridgerton only watch other dramas or only watch other romance. They watch a lot of stuff. But it's supposed to be flash. You know, it's for a talk. So.
Oh no, it's very across you, and I wonder why it is that all network diagrams are more useful as like drawing people in. I've never like. I think there's just a complexity to it. We're accustomed to seeing these displays in like sci-fi movies where there's a bunch of network stuff going on. I don't know.
Yeah, I also feel like people like circles a lot. Just like there's like something about circles people like.
Oh yeah, sure.
They just kind of draw. People like them, I feel like. But yeah, this worked. I mean, people were happy with it, so that worked out.
Oh no, it looks great. It looks great. What else? Let's go to the next one, and or maybe there we go.
Oh yeah,
small multiples.
Yeah, this is a ggplot creation actually. Yeah, just like looking at again using my 1D shot chart, but to try to encode a whole lot of information all at once, so you can see like the brightness is like very good at this shot, like very efficient shot for this person. The spike is like how much they shoot at that space. So you'd want to see a very bright spike and not a very dark spike. And it's like kind of fun to just kind of look across and see quickly like, oh, these people have different styles, or these people are really inefficient because their big spikes or their hills are dark. It's not ideal.
I mean, that's an interesting, like, there's an interesting concept that I've always struggled with, which is the idea of like motifs within visualization, and how you've applied a band on top of a continuous range for the line, and there is visually, we can see that this thing turns purple and it's a peak, but that's not an actual like feature in the SVG. It's not like a piece of insight that I can grab and pull out of that. Instead, it has to live in my head, right? Like there's all this combinatorial stuff. Like if I see a bunch of nodes around each other in some kind of space, there's no bucket except the one that lives in my head. And that I always thought was challenging for building more sophisticated sort of workflows with data visualization.
Yeah, totally. Having to balance the like limitations of what people are capable of and like how much can we provide for them for free.
Yeah,
but you can still get a good amount. I think it's kind of,
oh no, it's amazing.
Yeah, I think a lot of these is also like a lot of things I've done have been a goal of just like have some fun, like it's not serious. Like,
I like that you called him Russell Westbrook 3 years early.
I know, you can see his big 3-point hump of darkness. Sorry, Russ.
And here we go with doing some 3D stuff just to lose our audience.
Right, I know. Well, I've always just felt like this is where it gets into like the nice phase of like, can we do this? I don't know. No one's doing it yet, but we have these, because I follow a lot of software engineering trends, or like just, we can now do like very easily blend React and WebGL. I was like, well, I know the hard way of doing this, but this now seems easy. I'm not saying this is a good idea, but we can. Let's try it. And I feel like I have a lot of joy out of just proving that something's possible, and then I don't like use it for analysis. It's just like, yeah, this is kind of cool. And we can animate it and we can do these things. And I think that's like the engineering side of me where I'm like, can I do this? And then if I can do it and share how to do it, then who knows what people will do with it in the future. Maybe it's net negative. I don't know. But
no, I think I think that's a perfectly reasonable reason for building these things. Peter, we're coming up to the end of it. This has been just a wonderful conversation. I wish we'd had some time to get into a little more of your work, but I think that we touched on a lot of things that are important for folks who are interested in data visualization as a career, but also folks who are interested in data visualization and sort of the effect it has on society. I think one of the things you said very early on, which I felt as I was looking through the basketball viz when I was exploring it myself, and then when we were exploring it together, is that I'm not a big basketball fan. Like I live next to the Warriors, so I get excited because they keep winning, and that's cool. But I don't know much about basketball. I don't pay much attention to it. Yet I enjoy it in a different way when reading these stats. Same with baseball and football. I don't think has a great sort of visualization culture around it, but baseball does. Basketball definitely does, and a bit around soccer. But I think that that's a really exciting proposition, right? That you can make meaning of and experience these things through data visualization. Not just understand them, but experience them in a way that brings you joy and excitement that you would have also, that, we typically associate with watching men actually throw a ball and the ball actually goes into a little net, right?
Yeah, and now there's like actually, I feel like now there's a trend of like this kind of meta fan who's like maybe not even watching the games and is just engaging in the social commentary and like these like visualization side of things, which is totally valid. I feel like it's just a different form of entertainment, and it's
It's a
interesting
very
to open
different,
the gate.
yeah.
You know.
Yeah, it's a very different form, and I think that one that, as far as I know, is underexplored, but from both sides, from like understanding it, but also from sort of building content for those people, right? Like it does seem like uh, in that sort of way that we dumb down everything to bar charts. I think that the NBA, Netflix, like these companies don't realize that there's an audience for these very sophisticated representations of the system.
Yeah, you don't see a lot. I feel like, I know we're getting to the end of time, but we don't see a lot of. I feel like data viz is like couched in this idea of like serious analytics, but there is
Yeah.
like this space of like fun and just like you can still do data viz with a light heart, and like it can engage in a different way, and that's not wrong. You can be mad about 3D pie charts, but they can be fun and they don't have to be so serious, and it's okay. Like not everything is a very life or death situation.
I think that's what you had 8 years ago. I think that there was like a certain peak of just that sort of enthusiasm. And I think it is something that we need to sort of think about and ask if that's changed and why that's changed and whether or not that was necessarily a good thing. Peter, every time that we end these interviews, we give the interviewee a chance to sort of highlight something that they think is important. So we've had bunny rabbits and we've had startups. And I'm wondering, was there anything that you wanted to make prominent?
Sure.
That you wanted to sort of bring to the attention of our audience?
Yeah, to the wide audience following, I'd love you all to visit netflix.com. Memberships are a great price, great value add. Our stock is it's on the upswing, right? I think we're going to come back with your help. So thank you all for contributing to the livelihood of all us Netflixers and ex-Netflixers out there.
So as an ex-Netflixer, I can't endorse your statement because of ethical reasons, but I'm glad you made it. Peter, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me. Take care.
Yes, sir. Take care.